The morning of August 15th dawned crisp and clear along the Oregon coast, with Captain Jake Patterson performing his final equipment checks aboard the fishing vessel Pacific Dawn. At 52 years old, Patterson had been working these waters for nearly 3 decades, and he knew better than most that the Pacific Ocean demanded respect from even the most experienced mariners. The weather forecast called for moderate conditions over the next 3 days, perfect for their planned fishing expedition to the productive waters 30 miles offshore. His crew consisted of 4 experienced fishermen, each bringing unique skills to their operation. First mate Danny O'Brien, a weathered 45-year-old from a long line of Oregon fishermen, served as Patterson's right hand and possessed an almost supernatural ability to read weather patterns. Engineer Luis Vasquez, 38, had spent 15 years maintaining fishing boat engines and could coax power from machinery that others would have written off as scrap. Deckhand Tommy Nakamura, 29, brought youthful energy and an impressive work ethic that had earned him respect among the veteran crew. The newest addition was Mark Stevens, 24, making only his 5th trip aboard the Pacific Dawn, but eager to prove himself in the demanding world of commercial fishing. The Pacific Dawn herself was a testament to solid construction and careful maintenance. Built in 1995, the 65-foot vessel had weathered countless storms and brought home hundreds of thousands of pounds of fish over her career. Her twin diesel engines purred with mechanical precision as Patterson guided her through the harbor entrance, while O'Brien plotted their course to known productive fishing grounds. The boat carried all required safety equipment: life rafts, emergency beacons, survival suits, and enough supplies for a week at sea should weather force them to extend their trip. As they cleared the coastal waters and headed into the open Pacific, the crew settled into their familiar routines. Stevens worked alongside Nakamura, preparing the nets and checking equipment, while Vasquez monitored the engines and O'Brien kept watch from the wheelhouse. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, its surface painted in shades of deep blue and green that seemed to change with every shift of the morning light. Seabirds wheeled overhead, following the boat in hopes of easy meals when the nets came up, and dolphins occasionally raced alongside their bow wave in playful displays of maritime fellowship. If you're captivated by this incredible story of survival against impossible odds, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love connecting with viewers from around the world. Now let's continue with this remarkable tale of human endurance. By noon, they had reached their intended fishing grounds, and the crew began the methodical work of commercial fishing. The sonar showed promising fish concentrations at various depths, and Patterson made the decision to deploy their nets in a pattern that had proven successful in previous trips. The work was physically demanding but satisfying, requiring coordination and timing that came only from years of experience working together. Stevens proved his worth by quickly adapting to the crew's rhythm, earning approving nods from the veteran fishermen as he handled lines and equipment with increasing confidence. The afternoon brought their first modest success, several hundred pounds of rockfish and lingcod that would fetch good prices at the dock. But Patterson knew from experience that the real money came from longer sets in deeper water, so he made the decision to work through the night and into the following day. The crew was experienced with overnight operations, and the weather remained stable with light winds and manageable swells that posed no threat to their operations. It was during the early morning hours of their second day that the first signs of trouble appeared on the horizon. O'Brien, taking his turn at watch, noticed a dark line of clouds building to the northwest, a direction from which Pacific storms typically approached the Oregon coast. The barometric pressure had begun dropping steadily over the past few hours, and the wind was starting to pick up from a previously calm state. Patterson studied the weather patterns through binoculars and consulted his electronic weather instruments, finding conditions that differed significantly from the benign forecast they had received before departure. Within 2 hours, what had been a mild weather disturbance transformed into something far more serious. The wind increased to gale force, driving waves that grew progressively larger and more violent. Patterson made the decision to secure all fishing operations and begin heading back toward port, but the storm was moving faster than anyone had anticipated. Radio communications with the Coast Guard confirmed that a powerful low-pressure system had unexpectedly intensified, creating dangerous conditions across a wide area of the coastal Pacific. The Pacific Dawn had weathered rough seas before, but this storm quickly escalated beyond anything in Patterson's extensive experience. Waves that had started at manageable heights of 8 to 10 feet grew progressively larger, reaching 20 feet, then 30, then an intimidating 40 feet that towered above the wheelhouse. The vessel climbed each mountainous wave with engines straining, crested the peak in a moment of weightless suspension, then crashed down the backside in a bone-jarring impact that tested every joint and weld in her construction. Vasquez worked frantically in the engine room, monitoring temperatures and pressures as the twin diesels fought against the increasingly violent seas. The constant pounding was causing minor leaks in several systems, requiring continuous attention to keep the machinery running at peak efficiency. Meanwhile, O'Brien and Patterson took turns at the helm, fighting to keep the boat positioned properly relative to the waves, a critical factor in surviving heavy weather conditions. The younger crew members, Nakamura and Stevens, had never experienced seas this rough, and both were fighting severe seasickness while trying to secure equipment that had broken loose during the worst wave impacts. Everything not permanently bolted down had become a potential projectile, creating dangerous conditions below deck. Stevens, despite his inexperience, showed remarkable determination in helping to secure loose gear while battling waves of nausea that left him retching between tasks. Communication with shore became increasingly difficult as the storm intensified. The radio crackled with emergency traffic from other vessels caught in the same weather system, painting a picture of widespread dangerous conditions across the region. Patterson managed to transmit their position and status to the Coast Guard, but atmospheric interference made reliable communication nearly impossible. Their GPS system continued functioning, providing accurate position information, but the electronic navigation equipment was being affected by the violent motion of the boat. The crisis reached its peak when radar detected an enormous wave approaching from the northwest. A rogue wave significantly larger than the already dangerous 40-foot seas they had been battling. These rare phenomena, sometimes called walls of water, occur when multiple wave trains converge to create a single massive wave that can tower 60 feet or higher above the surrounding ocean. Such waves have been known to damage or sink even large commercial vessels, and the Pacific Dawn, impressive as she was, had never been designed to handle such extreme conditions. Patterson had perhaps 30 seconds to react as the massive wave bore down on their position. Experience told him that meeting such a wave head-on was their only chance of survival, so he pushed the engines to maximum power and turned the bow directly toward the approaching wall of water. The crew braced themselves as best they could, knowing that the next few moments would determine whether they lived or died. The wave seemed to blot out the sky as it approached, rising higher and higher until it resembled a moving mountain of dark green water topped with wind-whipped foam. The impact was beyond anything any of them had ever experienced. The Pacific Dawn climbed the wave face at an impossible angle, her propellers cavitating in the aerated water as Vasquez fought to maintain engine power. For a terrifying moment at the wave's crest, the entire vessel was airborne, suspended above the ocean in a physics-defying moment of weightlessness. Then came the crash, as 65 feet of fishing boat slammed back into the ocean with tremendous force, sending shockwaves through every structural member. The wheelhouse windows exploded inward under the water pressure, flooding the bridge with icy Pacific water and rendering most of the electronic navigation equipment useless. O'Brien was thrown against the chart table with enough force to crack 2 ribs, while Stevens was knocked unconscious when a loose piece of equipment struck his head during the impact. Most critically, the tremendous stress of the rogue wave had opened seams in the hull below the waterline, allowing seawater to pour into the engine room and forward compartments at an alarming rate. Vasquez immediately recognized the gravity of their situation as he watched water levels rising in the engine compartment despite the bilge pumps running at maximum capacity. The hull breach was too extensive for their pumping capacity to handle, and it was only a matter of time before the rising water reached critical electrical systems. He shouted warnings to the wheelhouse while trying to keep the engines running long enough for the crew to prepare for the worst-case scenario, abandoning ship in the middle of one of the worst storms in recent Pacific Northwest history. Patterson made the most difficult decision of his maritime career as he watched his beloved vessel losing her battle with the incoming water. The Pacific Dawn had been his livelihood, his pride, and his home away from home for over 15 years, but she was dying beneath their feet. With O'Brien injured and Stevens barely conscious, the captain knew they had minutes, not hours, to launch their life raft and abandon the sinking vessel. The storm still raged around them with undiminished fury, making the prospect of survival in a small raft seem almost impossibly remote. The crew worked with desperate efficiency to deploy their emergency life raft while the Pacific Dawn settled deeper in the water. The inflatable raft, designed to hold 6 people, would be their only shelter against the Pacific storm that showed no signs of abating. Nakamura helped the injured Stevens while O'Brien, despite his broken ribs, assisted with launching procedures. Vasquez made a final check of the engine room, confirming that the water had reached levels that made further pumping efforts futile, then joined the others on deck for the most terrifying moment of their lives. Launching a life raft in 40-foot seas requires precise timing and no small amount of luck. The raft must be deployed when the vessel is in a wave trough, allowing enough time for the crew to board before the next wave cycle begins. Patterson coordinated the launch with the skill that had made him a respected captain, waiting for the optimal moment when wind and wave conditions provided their best chance of success. The raft inflated properly and held position alongside the sinking Pacific Dawn, just long enough for all 5 crew members to scramble aboard before the fishing vessel began her final plunge toward the ocean floor. Watching their boat disappear beneath the waves was emotionally devastating for the entire crew. The Pacific Dawn had been more than just a vessel. She had been their workplace, their second home, and their source of livelihood. As her wheelhouse lights flickered one final time before vanishing forever, each man confronted the reality that they were now completely dependent on a small inflatable raft for survival in conditions that challenged even large commercial vessels. The storm continued raging around them with undiminished intensity, tossing their tiny craft like a cork in a washing machine. The first night in the life raft tested their endurance beyond anything they had previously experienced. The raft pitched and rolled in ways that defied comprehension, climbing wave faces that seemed vertical, then plunging into troughs that felt like falling off cliffs. All 5 men succumbed to violent seasickness that left them retching over the side while trying to maintain their grip on safety lines. Stevens, still suffering from his head injury, drifted in and out of consciousness, adding medical emergency to their already desperate situation. O'Brien's broken ribs made every breath painful and limited his ability to help with necessary tasks like bailing water and adjusting the raft's sea anchor. Nakamura, despite his youth and general good health, was perhaps hit hardest by the motion sickness, spending most of the night curled in a fetal position while his body rebelled against the unnatural movement. Only Patterson and Vasquez retained enough functionality to perform essential tasks like monitoring their emergency equipment and trying to maintain radio contact with potential rescuers. Their emergency supplies, while adequate for the life raft's rated capacity, seemed pitifully small when measured against the vastness of their predicament. The waterproof container held enough fresh water for perhaps 4 days, if carefully rationed, along with emergency food rations that might last a week if they controlled their consumption. More importantly, they had several emergency flares, a handheld radio with questionable battery life, and an emergency beacon that transmitted their position to satellite rescue coordination centers, assuming the beacon was functioning properly and that someone was monitoring the appropriate frequencies. As dawn broke on their first full day in the life raft, the storm had finally begun to moderate, though the seas remained dangerously rough. Patterson took inventory of their situation with the methodical approach that had made him a successful fishing captain. They were approximately 35 miles from the Oregon coast, drifting in current patterns that would carry them farther from shore rather than toward rescue. Their emergency beacon showed a steady transmission light, suggesting that distress signals were being sent, but there was no way to confirm that anyone was receiving those signals. The psychological challenge of their situation was perhaps as dangerous as the physical threats they faced. Being surrounded by endless ocean in all directions created a profound sense of isolation and helplessness that tested even the strongest personalities. Stevens, when conscious, stared blankly at the horizon with an expression that worried Patterson. Nakamura oscillated between periods of determined optimism and moments of near panic when the reality of their situation overwhelmed his emotional defenses. By the second day, radio communications revealed the scope of the storm system that had destroyed their vessel. Multiple boats had reported damage, several fishing vessels were overdue, and the Coast Guard was coordinating search efforts across a vast area of the Pacific. However, the sheer size of the ocean made finding individual survivors extremely difficult, even with modern satellite technology and coordinated air searches. Their small orange life raft, while highly visible under ideal conditions, could easily be missed by search aircraft in the aftermath of a major storm. Water rationing became a critical factor in their survival strategy. Patterson instituted strict controls that allowed each man 2 small sips of fresh water in the morning and 2 more in the evening, barely enough to maintain basic biological functions. The temptation to drink seawater became overwhelming as dehydration progressed, but all crew members understood that saltwater consumption would accelerate their decline rather than providing relief. They began collecting rainwater using their shirts and pieces of the life raft's canopy during brief showers that provided temporary reprieve from the blazing sun. Food rationing proved equally challenging, as their bodies craved calories to maintain core temperature during cold Pacific nights. The emergency rations provided minimal nutrition while tasting like cardboard, but they represented the difference between life and death over the extended period they might spend awaiting rescue. Patterson calculated that they could maintain minimum caloric intake for approximately 10 days if they exercised iron discipline, though he privately wondered if rescue would come within that time frame. The third day brought their first false hope when Nakamura spotted what appeared to be a ship on the distant horizon. All 5 men watched intently as the object moved across their field of vision, but it passed without any indication that their small raft had been spotted. The crushing disappointment of near rescue was almost worse than having no hope at all, and Stevens retreated further into the catatonic state that increasingly worried his crewmates. O'Brien's injuries were clearly affecting his breathing, and Vasquez was beginning to show signs of infection in small cuts he had sustained during the abandonment of their vessel. By the fourth day, the physical effects of exposure and dehydration were becoming apparent in all 5 survivors. Their lips had cracked and begun bleeding, their tongues were swollen, and their skin had started the painful process of severe sunburn, despite their efforts to create shade using pieces of clothing. The nights brought bone-chilling cold that made sleep nearly impossible, while the days delivered punishing heat that seemed to leach moisture from their bodies through every pore. Their urine had turned dark amber, indicating dangerous levels of dehydration despite their careful water rationing. The hallucinations began on the 5th day, starting with Stevens claiming he could hear his girlfriend calling his name across the water. Initially, the others dismissed this as the expected psychological response to extreme stress, but soon all 5 men were experiencing various forms of sensory distortion. Nakamura became convinced that he could see lights beneath the water, while O'Brien insisted that he heard helicopter rotors that never materialized into actual aircraft. Even Patterson, the most mentally stable of the group, found himself questioning whether distant clouds might actually be ships, or whether birds flying overhead could be search aircraft. Their radio communications with the outside world had become sporadic as the battery weakened and atmospheric conditions interfered with transmission. They had managed to establish brief contact with the Coast Guard station on the morning of the 6th day, confirming that search operations were ongoing and that their general area was being covered by aircraft patrols. However, the vastness of the Pacific Ocean meant that even intensive search efforts might miss their small raft unless conditions were perfect for visibility. The 7th day marked a full week since the loss of the Pacific Dawn, and their physical condition was deteriorating rapidly. Stevens had not spoken coherently for 2 days, while O'Brien was clearly struggling with breathing difficulties that suggested possible pneumonia developing in his damaged chest. Vasquez maintained his mechanical mindset by constantly monitoring and adjusting their emergency equipment, but his movements had become slow and deliberate as dehydration affected his motor functions. Nakamura spent increasing amounts of time staring at the horizon, occasionally pointing at objects that the others could not see. Water supplies reached critical levels on the 8th day, forcing Patterson to reduce their rations to single sips, morning and evening. The emergency food had been exhausted 2 days earlier, leaving them dependent on whatever rainwater they could collect, and the slim hope that rescue would arrive before their bodies shut down completely. The psychological pressure of command weighed heavily on Patterson as he watched his crew deteriorating, knowing that every decision he made could determine whether they lived or died in their small orange sanctuary. It was during the early morning of the 9th day that O'Brien spotted something that appeared different from the countless false alarms they had experienced. On the horizon, barely visible in the dawn light, a dark shape emerged that seemed more substantial than the usual illusions created by heat and desperation. As they watched over several hours, the object remained consistent in size and shape, growing gradually larger in a way that suggested it was actually approaching their position rather than being another cruel trick of their oxygen-starved minds. The shape resolved itself into a small, rocky island, perhaps 200 yards long and half that width, rising perhaps 50 feet above the surrounding ocean. It was clearly uninhabited and appeared to be nothing more than a bare rock outcrop. But after 9 days in their cramped life raft, even the most barren land represented hope for survival. Ocean currents were carrying them steadily toward the island, and Patterson made the decision to use their remaining strength to paddle in that direction using their hands and the small emergency oar. Reaching the island required navigating dangerous waters, where waves crashed against jagged rocks with tremendous force. Their approach was made even more treacherous by their weakened condition and the life raft's limited maneuverability. O'Brien sustained a deep gash on his left leg while scrambling from the raft onto the rocks, but they had achieved what had seemed impossible just hours earlier, solid ground beneath their feet for the first time in over a week. The island was desolate beyond imagination, covered in bird droppings and littered with driftwood that had washed ashore during countless storms. However, it offered several advantages over their cramped life raft: protection from wind, space to move around, and most critically, several small depressions in the rocks that had collected fresh rainwater from recent weather systems. The water was brackish and tasted strongly of minerals, but it was infinitely preferable to the seawater that surrounded them on all sides. Their first priority was establishing shelter and treating O'Brien's injured leg, which was bleeding freely and showed signs of immediate infection risk. Using fabric torn from their clothing and seawater for cleaning, they managed to create a makeshift bandage that would protect the wound from further contamination. Vasquez explored the island's small interior and discovered several areas where they could find protection from wind and weather, along with scattered bird eggs that represented their first real food in several days. The island's highest point offered an unobstructed view in all directions, making it an ideal location for signaling potential rescue aircraft. Patterson realized that their emergency flares, which would have been difficult to spot from their low position in the life raft, could be much more effective when fired from the island's elevated position. More importantly, the rocky surface provided materials for creating visual signals that could be seen from much greater distances than their small raft had offered. It was Nakamura who first suggested creating an SOS message using the island's abundant supply of rocks and driftwood. The concept was simple, but would require enormous effort in their weakened condition. Arrange stones and wooden debris to spell out distress letters large enough to be visible from aircraft flying at normal search altitudes. Patterson calculated that each letter would need to be at least 20 feet in length to be spotted from the distances at which search planes typically operated. The work began immediately, with all 5 survivors contributing whatever strength they could muster to the massive undertaking. They selected a flat area near the island's highest point, where the letters would be most visible from multiple directions. Using lighter-colored coral and driftwood to create contrast against the darker rock surface, they began the painstaking process of moving hundreds of individual stones to form the universal distress signal. Stevens, despite his head injury and general weakness, seemed to find new purpose in the construction project. Working slowly but methodically, he focused on perfecting the curves and angles of each letter, demonstrating an attention to detail that impressed his crewmates. O'Brien, hampered by his leg injury and broken ribs, primarily served as supervisor and quality control, ensuring that the letters maintained proper proportions and spacing for maximum visibility from above. The physical demands of moving rocks under the blazing sun pushed their dehydrated bodies to the breaking point. Vasquez collapsed twice during the first day of construction, while Nakamura's hands began bleeding from handling the sharp-edged stones. But they persevered, driven by the knowledge that this message might represent their only realistic chance of being spotted by rescue aircraft. Each stone placed was an act of defiance against the ocean that had tried to claim their lives. By the end of their second day on the island, they had completed the letter S and made significant progress on the first O. The work was proceeding more slowly than Patterson had hoped, but the results were impressive even from ground level. Using pieces of white coral and the lightest colored driftwood they could find, the letters created strong visual contrast against the island's dark, volcanic rock. They also constructed a large arrow pointing toward their shelter area, ensuring that rescuers would know exactly where to find them if they spotted the signal. Water remained their most critical concern, despite the rainwater they had found in the rock depressions. The supply was limited and would not sustain 5 men for more than a few days during the hot summer weather. They established strict rationing procedures and began praying for rain showers that could replenish their precious reserves. Bird eggs provided some nutrition, but they were small and difficult to find, as the island's wildlife began avoiding the areas where the survivors were working. The third day on the island brought completion of their SOS message, though the effort had drained their remaining energy reserves. The letters stretched nearly 200 feet across the island's elevated plateau, clearly visible from any direction depending on the sun's angle and lighting conditions. They had also arranged additional stones to create geometric patterns around the main message, ensuring that any pilot who spotted the signal would immediately recognize it as an intentional distress call rather than natural rock formations. O'Brien's leg wound was showing concerning signs of infection, despite their efforts to keep it clean with seawater. The gash was deeper than initially apparent and had become inflamed and painful to the touch. Without proper medical supplies or antibiotics, they could only hope that his body's natural defenses would fight off the infection before it became life-threatening. The injury was also limiting his mobility, making him increasingly dependent on the others for basic needs. Their fourth day on the island dawned clear and calm, with unlimited visibility in all directions, perfect conditions for aerial spotting. They maintained constant watch schedules, with at least one person always scanning the horizon for aircraft or ships that might be conducting search operations. The psychological strain of waiting was almost unbearable, particularly when they occasionally heard the distant sound of aircraft engines that never materialized into visible planes. Stevens claimed to have spotted a helicopter during the early afternoon, but the others saw nothing when they rushed to look in the direction he indicated. These false alarms were becoming more frequent as their physical condition deteriorated, and Patterson worried that they were all beginning to lose their grip on reality. The combination of dehydration, starvation, and exposure was affecting their minds as well as their bodies, creating a dangerous situation where they might miss real rescue opportunities while chasing phantom aircraft. It was during the morning of their fifth day on the island, 14th day since losing the Pacific Dawn, that their persistence was finally rewarded. Nakamura was the first to hear it, a distant droning sound that gradually grew louder and more distinct. This time, the sound persisted and grew stronger, eliminating any doubt that an aircraft was actually approaching their position. Soon, all 5 survivors could clearly hear the unmistakable noise of turboprop engines that grew steadily louder as the aircraft approached from the northeast. The Coast Guard C-130 search plane appeared as a speck on the horizon, flying in the systematic grid pattern that characterizes professional search operations. The crew watched in tense silence as the aircraft approached, afraid to celebrate until they were certain they had been spotted. As the plane passed directly over their island at approximately 2,000 feet altitude, they could see the pilot banking sharply for a closer examination of their stone message. Then came the most beautiful sight of their ordeal. The aircraft's wings waggled back and forth in the universal aviation signal, acknowledging their distress call. The rescue sequence that followed demonstrated the professionalism and efficiency of Coast Guard operations. Within 90 minutes of being spotted, a rescue helicopter arrived from Air Station Astoria, having been dispatched immediately after the search plane confirmed survivors on the island. The helicopter crew assessed the situation and determined that the rocky terrain made landing impossible, so they would need to use their rescue basket to lift each survivor individually from the island to the aircraft. Stevens was evacuated first, due to his head injury and overall weakened condition. The basket lowered from the helicopter swayed dramatically in the rotor wash, requiring careful timing to load safely. Nakamura went next, followed by the injured O'Brien, who required assistance getting into the basket due to his leg wound and broken ribs. Vasquez and Patterson were the final 2 to leave their temporary home, and both men took one last look at the SOS message that had saved their lives before ascending to safety. The helicopter flight to the mainland took 45 minutes, during which the survivors received their first professional medical attention in 2 weeks. Coast Guard rescue medics started IV fluids to combat severe dehydration and monitored vital signs that showed the effects of their prolonged ordeal. Warm blankets felt like unimaginable luxury after weeks of exposure, while the steady flight of the helicopter seemed impossibly smooth compared to the violent motion they had endured in their life raft. At the trauma center in Portland, medical evaluation revealed the full extent of their survival achievement. Each man had lost between 25 and 40 pounds, representing dangerous levels of muscle mass consumption as their bodies had metabolized tissue to maintain vital functions. Blood tests showed severe electrolyte imbalances, dehydration markers, and early signs of organ stress, but remarkably, none of the survivors had suffered permanent damage from their ordeal. O'Brien required immediate surgery to clean and properly close his infected leg wound, while Stevens underwent neurological evaluation for his head injury sustained during the sinking. Vasquez and Nakamura were treated for severe dehydration and malnutrition, with careful monitoring as their digestive systems readjusted to regular food intake. Patterson, despite being the oldest member of the crew, had maintained the best overall condition due to his methodical approach to rationing and his psychological resilience as the group's leader. The Coast Guard's investigation into their rescue revealed several important factors that had contributed to their survival. Their emergency beacon had indeed been transmitting properly, but atmospheric conditions and their position far from shore had prevented the signal from reaching rescue coordination centers during the critical first week. Once search operations began in earnest, after their vessel was reported overdue, aircraft had been systematically covering grid patterns that would eventually have found them, but their stone SOS message had accelerated discovery by an estimated 3 to 4 days. The visibility of their distress signal exceeded all expectations, with the search plane crew reporting that the message was clearly identifiable from over 8 miles away under optimal lighting conditions. The contrast between light-colored coral and dark volcanic rock, combined with the large size of the letters, created a signal that stood out dramatically against the natural landscape. Coast Guard officials noted that the survivors' methodical approach to construction and attention to detail had transformed a desperate situation into a textbook example of effective distress signaling. Media coverage of their rescue captivated the nation, with their story being featured prominently on television news programs and in newspapers across the country. The image of 5 men working together to create a massive SOS message from rocks became an iconic representation of human determination and ingenuity in the face of seemingly impossible odds. Letters and emails poured in from around the world, with many people expressing admiration for their teamwork and refusal to give up hope during their darkest moments. The survivors themselves handled their newfound fame with characteristic modesty, consistently crediting each other with their successful rescue. Patterson praised O'Brien's navigation skills and weather expertise, while O'Brien highlighted Vasquez's mechanical knowledge and ability to keep their equipment functioning. Nakamura was recognized for his physical strength and tireless work on the stone message, while Stevens was commended for his determination to contribute despite his injuries. Each man emphasized that survival had been a team effort, requiring every person's unique contributions. In the months following their rescue, all 5 men gradually returned to fishing, though their experience had changed their approach to maritime safety forever. They invested in enhanced emergency equipment, including multiple forms of satellite communication, advanced life rafts with extended supply capacity, and personal locator beacons for each crew member. Their story became a case study taught in maritime safety courses, demonstrating both the importance of proper emergency equipment and the power of human resourcefulness when technology fails. The small island where they created their life-saving message was subsequently named SOS Island by the Coast Guard, and their stone distress signal remained visible for several years as a testament to their ordeal. Other mariners passing the area would often detour to see the site where 5 fishermen had refused to surrender to the Pacific Ocean, transforming desperation into determination through teamwork and ingenuity. The island became an unofficial monument to maritime survival, inspiring countless others who faced their own challenges on the unforgiving seas. Patterson eventually returned to command another fishing vessel, but he never forgot the lessons learned during those 14 days when the ocean tested his crew's will to survive. He instituted new safety protocols and training programs that emphasized the psychological aspects of survival as much as the technical requirements. His crew's story proved that even in humanity's most desperate moments, cooperation, determination, and creative problem-solving could overcome challenges that seemed insurmountable, transforming ordinary fishermen into extraordinary survivors whose courage would inspire generations of maritime professionals.